Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is the return of Big Bad Wolf and his fantastic, chilling stories. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled I'm a different kind of police officer. I have been face to face with the epitome of fear. Let's get straight into that. There's nothing wrong with a little fear. Being fearful can save your life. It saved mine on more than one occasion. But too much fear can stop you from living. Roland Smith, Cryptid Hunters. Do you ever think about the legends and myths that you've heard about, wondering what could be lurking in the vast forests and deep seas? Do you ever feel a tinge of uneasiness as you venture into the woods at night, as you cannot shake the feeling of being watched from the tree line? My partner Douglas and I still experience fear, almost a fault, because we have come face to face with what lurks in the shadows. We are both creatures, or monsters, if you will. Yet we choose to make the world a better place. We hunt those criminals who walk in the light during the day. As police officers, we also hunt the beasts who walk at night, who threaten the way of life for normal folks. And Douglas is a were-panther, an unfortunate side effect of getting bitten during an escapade of ours during an investigation. I am a werewolf, due to a generational inheritance that spans hundreds of years. Just because we are beasts, however, does not mean that we do not know the chills that run down our spine, known as fear. One such encounter will forever be seared into our memories. Douglas and I were contacted by an agency that we have become quite acquainted with, a monster hunting brigade comprised of both humans and cryptids and other supernatural do-gooders. For anonymity, I will simply call them the brigade and use false names. I have to admit, when it comes to urban legends and mythical creatures, I am hesitant as to what I believe, despite the impeccable irony. When the brigade contacted us on an ongoing Wendigo investigation, Douglas and I had to go to the one person who could confirm its existence to us, my grandfather. A Wendigo, huh? I haven't dealt with one of those fuckers in ages. Not too common around these parts. My pop snorted. He poured each of us a cup of coffee as we settled onto the couch of his cabin high up in the mountain. Boys, Wendigos are the most dangerous assholes out there. And there's no humanity left in their minds. They'll kill anything that crosses their path. He took a sip of his coffee and leaned back into his old armchair. So, they're real? Douglas interjected, the excitement clear in his voice, and he was still fairly new to the world of the supernatural. Wendigos? Okay, wait. What about Bigfoot? Loch Ness Monster? Skinwalker? My grandfather pounded his mug onto the table and shushed my partner suddenly. Do not say their name! Douglas looked to the ground. My pop put his hand on his shoulder and met his eyes. The Sasquatch are real. Nice bunch. Just want to be left alone. I don't know shit about the Loch Ness Monster. The thing probably wants to be left alone too. And those things. He paused and looked out of the window. They're more realistic than they should be. He sat back and brought his gaze to meet both of ours. Boys, the Wendigo is an ancient, living, cannibalistic bastard of a creature. You won't have much trouble finding it if you go looking, which I don't advise you to. He stopped and looked deep into my eyes, a solemn look on his face. You are a grown man, Ryan. You're also as stubborn as a mule, so I know you'll go after this fucker if it's a danger to the people. He sat back and looked from me to Douglas before sighing. You two are fine officers. You're what every rookie should strive to be like. But you have to remember, regardless of your abilities, you can still be killed. Douglas turned to me as he remembered the shit show that almost cost him his life. Suddenly, he stood from the couch and looked out of the window to the sunset that crept over the mountain. Before all this shit happened, we took an oath to protect, Ryan, if there is even a slight chance we can defeat this thing, you know I'm behind you 100%. I nodded as I followed his stare out of the window. Every day, officers were getting killed in the line of duty, doing their jobs and leaving behind their families. We knew that if the least we could do was protect the community from the cannibalistic legend, then we were doing our duty to serve and protect, even in the darkness. "Take the job, boys," my grandfather said, breaking the silence, and we looked back at him. "I'll tell you everything I know about those creepy bastards. Do not let your guard down, though. With their appetite, they don't discriminate. They'll eat humans, and they'll sure as hell try to snack on a werewolf." Douglas and I both nodded in a deep, mutual acceptance. I looked to Douglas and back to my grandfather. "Tell us what you know, Pop." My grandfather walked to his old cabinet where he collected mementos and old journals from days past. After scrounging around for a few minutes, he returned with an old, leather-bound journal. Its pages were loosely bound and dust-covered in its front. He sat on the armchair in front of us and began to thumb through the contents of the book. "Back in the day, I had my own run-in with a Wendigo." He paused as he opened the book to what appeared to be a well-drawn sketch. "Was the scariest beast I've ever encountered." He let his eyes rest on the sketch. "Its head looks like a wolf's skull with a huge rack of antlers that would make the best of deer hunters jealous." A smile flashed across his face as he looked back to us, and it quickly disappeared. "The one I saw bordered on 10 feet tall. I've heard, though, those fuckers can be up to 15. Looking back down at the sketch, he continued to describe the monster in vivid detail. "The fuckers look like they've been decaying for a while, and no matter how much they eat, they're never satisfied." He paused and looked back up to us. "It's all a part of the curse. For whatever reason, Wendigos were once normal human beings, forced into cannibalism to survive. But boys, remember that the humanity that once lingered in their souls is long gone." As we gathered our notes and the files that the brigade provided to us, my grandfather watched. Looking down at his leather journal, he walked up to me. "I was going to wait to give you this." He paused. "But I think now is an appropriate time, more than ever." He handed me the journal and smiled wryly. I ran my fingers across the aged leather. "It'll come in handy on this assignment, I do believe," he said as he looked it over. I smiled and gently placed the journal into my bag. "Be safe, boys," my pop exclaimed as we opened the front door to the little cabin. "Oh, and Ryan," he pulled me aside. "These beasts are smart. Don't let your guard down, and watch out for your partner." He nodded towards Douglas. "Do not underestimate the danger that you are facing." He lifted his shirt to reveal a scar I had seen before but never questioned. On his right side, up along his ribcage, was a thick, raised scar. 30 seconds is all it took for the bastard to do this to me." He dropped the shirt back down. "Keep eye contact. Don't turn your back on it. They'll lure you using tricks and delusions, so be smart. And Ryan," he placed his hand onto my shoulder, "stay alive." Douglas and I met the brigade guys at a rundown shack off a dirt path about 3 hours outside town. The directions were iffy, and it was only when we saw the figure standing outside the shack that we felt any relief. The first was Sean, a short, stocky vampire with a face that said, "I'm pissed off, but I don't know why." I assumed his anger sprouted from his height or lack thereof. Next to him was a tall, dark-skinned man who I knew from previous interactions was a Lycan like me. His name was Shelton, and he wore a stern, no-bullshit look plastered on his face at all times. As Douglas and I pulled up and got out of my Jeep, I knew we had a long night ahead of us. "About time y'all showed up," Sean mumbled as he hesitantly shook our hands. He or Shelton had not changed a bit since my last encounter with them, when we went to Elkhorn, Wisconsin to investigate sightings of a rogue werewolf. You might know this one, if you've ever heard of the Beast of Bray Road. And for the record, the Beast is an old-school werewolf who was trapped in its bestial form by a witch. Apparently the guy pissed off the wrong entity. A story for another time, perhaps. I introduced Douglas to the pair, and we sat around a small fire pit that the guys had made as the sun began to set in the background. "Ryan, this is a bad one," Sean began, staring at the fire as he spoke. "Must have come down off the nearby mountains, as it's not native to this area." I nodded. Something seemed strange in the way Sean hung his head. I immediately caught his distracted stare. "But there's more to it, isn't there?" I cocked my head to the side as Shelton shifted in his seat. He wasn't much of a talker, but his movements gave him away. Sean let out an exhausted sigh and shifted to where he was looking directly at Douglas and I. "This Wendigo has come here for a reason." He glanced into the darkening tree line behind him. "Guys, it is old as shit. Ancient, cursed ones like this don't just meander away from their territory randomly for fun." He gazed back into the fire as we sat quietly, deep in thought. Douglas spoke up, breaking the silence. "How do you know that it's an old one? And what would cause it to come down off the mountain?" he asked Sean, a confused look in his face. Sean shrugged and threw a stick into the fire. "We know because it's been on our radar a few times. As far as we can tell, it's been around a few hundred years. Keeps its distance because of the supernatural presence in this town." He nodded towards me. "Wendigos don't go looking for a fight. They lure their prey to them, screwing around with their other beings like we are just too much trouble. And during one of our routine sweeps, some of our guys wearing BACs, body cams, got obliterated by this thing. 3 of our personnel torn apart and devoured. All we found was some blood splatter and their vests. Thankfully, we recovered the footage from one of the guys." Shelton quickly removed the laptop from a bag on the ground, opened it up and turned it towards us. The footage was gruesome. That's the best way I can describe it. Limbs were ripped off and agonizing screams echoed from the laptop. At one point Douglas retched. "We have seen some brutal shit before, but this, it was different. This was clear video of some of the most intense carnage I have ever witnessed." Glimpses of the beast were shown, a horrifying nightmare of a creature shredding flesh from bone. Shelton closed the laptop and Sean spoke as he dropped his head again. "It's more powerful than we ever imagined. Those guys," he choked up, "they were good men, seasoned veterans of the hunt. They didn't stand a chance." I could have sworn I saw a tear run down his cheek in the light of the fire. "And this is the area?" I said quietly, trying to break the tension. Sean stared off into the void behind me, seemingly deep in thought. He looked at me with a sincere sadness in his eyes. "This is the place. In fact, I'll take you to the scene." Douglas and I followed Sean and Shelton into a heavily forested area behind the shack where we parked. We walked in silence for what seemed like hours. When I checked my phone, it was 2:33 a.m. and we had come to a stop. Sean turned to us and pointed to a small clearing to our left, and I immediately caught the scent of blood and gore. The scene was right next to us, and I was not prepared for what I had saw. Blood splatter gave a distinct pattern to the surrounding foliage. From what I could gather from the angle of the splatter, I knew that limbs had been torn off and bodies had been ripped into. There was nothing left of the men, other than a few pieces of cloth and one single boot. I turned to Douglas, who was examining an area that we believed was the location of the initial attack. "Ryan, I think I know how it snuck up on them." I walked over to him, listening curiously, and he looked up. There was a gap through the tops of the trees, as if something large crashed right through it. The bastard had dropped from the treetop. "Fuck, man. This thing must be seriously smart." Douglas was savagely cut off by a noise I can still hear in my nightmares to this day. It sounded similar to a cougar scream, only it was mixed with a demonic guttural snarl. Suddenly, Sean and Shelton tore through the branches, yelling hastily and waving their arms wildly in panic. The only words I could gather from their screams made the blood in my veins completely freeze up. "It's here! It's fucking here!" I'm a different kind of police officer. I came face to face with the epitome of fear. Part 2. Let's get straight into that. Isn't it incredible how nature tends to sense an incoming threat? The insects quiet their songs, the small mammals stop dead in their tracks. Hell, even the wind itself seems to come to a complete standstill. The inherent silence perpetuated by nature is enough to send chills up my spine, even to this day. I clearly recall the deadly quiet, with Sean and Shelton's footfalls and screams being the only sounds that exploded in the forest that day. After that horrifying screech, they rounded the corner like bats out of hell. The absolute terror in their eyes, along with the absence of nature's chatter, told me the certainty of the incoming threat. What I heard next confirmed the shouts coming from the brigade's officers. Directly behind Sean and Shelton came a thunderous crashing through the forest. It sounded as if a bulldozer was flattening everything in its path, coming straight towards us. I turned to Douglas and nodded as we both changed forms. As they reached our location at the scene, Shelton took his place beside us in his form, while Sean stood at the ready behind us, teeth glaring in the moonlight. We stood completely still, an eerie silence overtaking our senses as the monster paused just outside our line of sight. The smell hit me like a train, and I almost retched from the scent of death and decay. This beast took a step or two towards us, and I flinched as I saw it. Long, tall antlers rose out of the brush directly behind the tree line. I knew it was toying with us, almost as if it was giving us time to begin to panic. We stood completely still. I noticed that the sounds around us seemed to follow the trait. The only thing I could hear was the blood pumping through my heart, becoming almost deafening. I slowly turned my head towards Douglas, fear apparent on his cat-like face. Just as he turned to mouth a quick, "What the fuck?" in my direction, we again heard the screech which we had heard earlier. And this time, though, it was terrifyingly close, and I could feel the ground beneath me vibrate. I don't think I was mentally prepared for the shit show that finally appeared from behind that tree line. The fucker stood at least 10 feet tall, not including the bloody antlers that rose off its skull. Bits of flesh and matted fur hung from its ribcage, and its skull was stained in a bright crimson colour. The most disturbing trait, though, were its arms. Long, skinny arms dangled at its side, accompanied by knife-like claws that easily stretched 2 feet in length. Horrified, I held up my paw in a clenched position, letting Douglas know to hold steady. The Wendigo watched my every movement, its jaw hanging open and releasing harsh, raspy breaths. We stood there staring at its glowing red eyes for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the next movement. What happened next had me almost paralyzed from fear. From directly behind us, I heard something huge approaching on all fours. It was running full speed, and it was fast. My senses were so overwhelmed by the sickly smell of the beast in front of us that I could not make out what creature was coming straight in our direction. I slowly turned my head in horror to face the incoming visitor, not knowing what to expect to burst through the forest behind us. In a flash, the creature tore through the trees behind us and sped past the four of us, stopping in front of me, facing the terror at the tree line. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over my body as I recognized the werebear standing tall ahead of me. "Boys, you didn't tell me y'all were going after a fucking Wendigo," Randy snorted, his face keeping contact with the monstrosity ahead. I assume this new addition to our group really pissed the fucker off, because before I knew it, it released another otherworldly scream and tore through the trees directly at Randy. We all began sprinting at the creature, adrenaline pumping and hearts racing. And just as we reached Randy's position, I noticed a familiar silver glint flash before our eyes. Randy slammed the silver blade into the eye socket of the beast just as it reached him. He twisted the blade against the giant and stopped it in its tracks, and it screeched in agony, swiping its claws desperately at its face. Randy took this opportunity to turn to us and snarl, "Run, assholes!" That's all the reassurance we needed, because we all turned and hightailed it out of that damned forest. As we ran, tearing down branches and brush ahead of us, we continued to hear the roars of pain released by the creature. The unholy screeches only silenced as we reached the vehicles we had parked in front of the old shack earlier. All in unison, we stopped to change forms and struggled to catch our breath. I met Douglas's gaze as he slumped to the ground, his face contorted in terror. "Ryan, what the actual fuck?" He clamped his jaw shut as I saw the silver refract in the moonlight, as the blade whizzed past my head, embedding itself into a tree behind me. That big son of a bitch had slung the blade through the trees of my head. That action was all the motivation we needed as we grouped into our vehicles and got ready to haul ass out of there. Before he got into his old truck, Randy pulled the dagger out of the tree trunk and waved it at me through the Jeep window. I saw his mouth moving as he mumbled a slew of curses before hopping into his truck. I slammed the gas as Douglas closed the door and tore off down a dirt path we had come in on. My cell rang loudly, making both Douglas and I both jump in our seats. It was Randy. "Looks like we need a group therapy meeting," Randy yelled out as I swiped my phone to answer the call. "Call your fucking buddies, and you bunch of dumbasses meet me at your grandfather's place in 20 minutes. He barked as the phone line went quiet. I looked over at Douglas, a sense of relief on his face. "I think we fucked up," I said, a bit of a nervous chuckle in my voice. He shook his head with a grin appearing across his face. "No shit, man." He looked over at me as I drove like a hellion down the main road. "What the actual shit was that?" He looked back to the road in front of us. "I believe we bit off a little more than we could chew," I huffed as I called Sean and Shelton, informing them of the upcoming meeting at Pop's house. Douglas and I drove on, nervously talking about the situation we were now in. "Why was Randy so pissed off?" Douglas asked, a confused look on his face. "I guess we're going to find out here shortly," I added with a smirk as we pulled up the path towards my grandfather's cabin. Randy was already there, standing on the porch with my pop. They both wore a worried look as they watched us pull up. The boys from the brigade screeched up behind us, terror still etched into their faces, as they got out their vehicle and headed towards the porch. Something was wrong, and I knew it. The looks on my pop's and Randy's face told me that there was new information, and we were about to get a full-blown bitch session. As we all made our way to the porch, my grandfather stood in a doorway with an absent-minded gaze on his face. Randy stood in front of him, arms crossed, eyes glaring. And there was something else off, though. Someone or something else stood behind my grandfather, shrouded in the darkness of the cabin. He stepped out onto the porch, wearing a two-piece suit and dark sunglasses. The guy looked like an official, but also strangely familiar. I noticed Sean and Shelton both dropped their heads as the figure appeared, telling me that they knew exactly who was standing before us. The man stretched out his hand to me, a glimmer of white flashing across his face as he smiled. His teeth were sharp and pointed at the ends like tiny knives poking out of his gums. "Hello, Ryan," he said, his voice deep, slow and steady. "My name is Rostev. These boys here," he nodded towards Sean and Shelton, "almost got you killed." I stopped and turned to the two behind us, the heads still dropped and hands held behind their backs. I looked back to the strange man and cocked my head to the side. "What in the hell are you talking about?" I choked out, a blaring anger rising in my chest. Randy stepped in front of the man in black and stared intently into my eyes and then sternly glared at the officers behind us. "Fellas, it's about time we had ourselves that little group therapy session. Now!" I could sense the aggressive tinge in Randy's voice. The red glint seeping into Randy's irises told me that there was much, much more to this situation than what we had originally bargained for. My mind racing a million times a million miles a minute, we carefully followed the man in the suit and Randy into the cabin. Douglas elbowed me and widened his eyes, as if to ask what the hell was happening. I shrugged as we entered my pop's living room. Shock ran across my face as I stepped into the room. Papers were strewn everywhere, missing person posters were scattered across the table. The one thing that particularly stood out to me was a small, ornate chest in the middle of the table. I walked over to it and placed my hand on the top, carefully lifting the lid. Inside were some crumpled notes, and a broken piece of bone lay on top. Only then I realized that it was not bone, but a piece of long, sharp claw. I gasped loudly as I read the label pinned to the claw, my breathing almost coming to a complete halt. Alpha, Wendigo, Wittiva was written in red ink on the label. Underneath it in smaller print in the sentence that made me cringe in absolute dread. Status, active, immortal, do not engage under any circumstances. I'm a different kind of police officer. Sometimes you must look fear directly in its eyes. Let's get straight into that. According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NamUs, it is estimated that more than 600,000 people go missing in the United States alone every year. Tens of thousands of people remain missing for over a year, and those reports are then called cold cases. Everyone has their own opinion on reasoning when it comes to exploring these disappearances, ranging from government conspiracy theories to simple acts of Mother Nature. Individuals find their own ways to cope with the unknown. And when it comes to my opinion, I am just as stumped as everyone else. There are, however, cases that I know have been manipulated or brushed past in order to preserve human sanity. My eyes drifted over the missing person flyers that laid across the living room table. All of them had one particular common trait, and they were cold cases, or missing person cases that had no reasonable explanation behind them. Only I knew better. As I drowned out the ensuing conversation around me between the suit and the group, I realized that I knew the cause of some of these cold cases. All of them had something to do with the supernatural, or beings that the general population wasn't quite convinced existed. My gaze drifted to an old map that was tossed to the edge of the table. It was a map of our tri-state area riddled with red dots, and I quickly connected the flyers with the map. The dots represented missing person cases, forming a cluster right around our area, stretching upwards into 2 different states along the Smoky Mountain region. The sheer amount of dots forming a clusters completely blew my mind. But again, I knew better. I interrupted whatever conversation was being held around me. "This entity," I said aloud, halting the voices immediately. "It has something to do with the amount of people that go missing along the mountainside." I stared off into space, letting my mind catch up with my words. Rostev nodded his head slowly, the otherworldly smile never once leaving his face. "You see, Ryan," he began, "these officers here had an idea of what they were going up against, only they did not know the extent. This being is held responsible for every red dot you saw on that map. It is one of the first of the Wendigos, an Aloha, if you will," he explained, taking a map from the table. "Sean and Shelton were told directly by their supervisors not to engage this creature, essentially leading you all on a suicide mission." He smiled, his teeth glowing in the darkness. I could feel the tension in the air. "It is far more ancient than you realize, and far more powerful than you can imagine." He shook his head, eyes darting across the map. Before I realized what my body was doing, I quickly spun around and faced Sean and Shelton, my eyes burning and raging red. "You're telling me," I growled as my body morphed, "that these assholes almost made us into a statistic? Almost made us into another red dot on a map?" I roared in pure anger. Sean and Shelton kept their heads down, seemingly not surprised by my reaction. As I snarled in the direction of the 2 officers, Randy stepped in between my thrashing jaws and their bodies. "Calm yourself, Ryan. Damn it!" Randy held his hand inches from my snout. Almost immediately, I was brought down from my rage-induced transformation and took a step back. Randy relaxed a bit and looked at each of us as he spoke. "You can't tell me you've never been in a situation where you felt helpless," he began, shrugging his shoulders. "These boys ignorantly thought that they could take matters into their own hands. Only they knew they couldn't do it alone, and when their buddies were completely slaughtered by this beast, they knew they had to come to you. He shook his head solemnly. Douglas spoke up first, and for the first time during this interaction. "So, you guys could have gotten us all killed?" he said, a look of disbelief in his eyes. "You let us go into that forest, knowing what was out there, knowing that Ryan trusted you, and also knowing that you were forbidden from pursuing the case." A strange look of anger replaced his normal calm demeanor. He slumped onto the couch, his head in his hands. Sean lifted his head just enough to where he could see his glare. "We had no choice," he seethed through his teeth. "We had our reasons." He bowed his head once again. Douglas stood straight up, the same fire in his eyes I had earlier. "What kind of fucking reasons?" he snarled. This time it was Shelton who stood and slowly shuffled over to the table. He looked over the missing person flyers until his hand rested on one. He lifted it from the stack, showing us the picture of a beautiful little girl, maybe at around the age of 6. He held it up as he spoke. "My daughter, Haley." The room fell silent. "She is one of the red dots on that damn map." We learned that Shelton's daughter was taken from a campsite he had taken her and his wife to about a month back. He had seen the monster appear out of the darkness and snatch her from her birthday gathering they were having for her 7th birthday. My heart sank as he explained the details. "My wife and I," he said, hands shaking as he held the photo of the smiling little girl. "We need an answer, a body, a piece of clothing, anything. We need to know what happened to our little girl." The rest of that night was spent looking over the flyers and placing them with the dots on the map. Rustev sat in the corner, watching, that same terrifying grin on his face. My grandfather noticed the tension that his nonchalant demeanor was building in the room. "Rustev, this is my home," he began as he stood, eyes locked on the suit's dead eyes. "I believe it is time that I asked you to leave, so we can gather our thoughts." Randy stood from the couch, fists clenched, as he moved into position behind my grandfather. Rustev let out an otherworldly giggle as he shrugged his shoulders. "As you wish, sir." He headed for the other door, stopping and then turning his head towards us. He added, "Do not try to be a hero, fellas." And that insane grin still plastered across his face. "If I have to come back here, I won't be alone." And with that said, he seemed to vanish out of sight. We all looked at each other. Our expressions all showed similar thoughts. Shelton and Sean went to their vehicle some time later, after profusely expressing their apologies. We all followed them outside onto the porch into the darkness as we solemnly said our goodbyes. Before driving off, Sean rolled down his window and motioned Douglas and I over. "We will be seeing you boys soon." And with that, they drove out of the driveway and we watched as their lights disappeared into the darkness of the road. Douglas and I turned, walking back to join Randy and my grandfather on the porch. As soon as we reached the top step, what we heard sent a lightning bolt down my spine. A loud, demonic, guttural roar erupted from the forest behind my grandfather's cabin. I'm a different kind of police officer. Sometimes you must look fear directly in its eyes. Part 3. Let's get straight into that. The Wendigo had given us a final warning. The problem was, I have always been extremely hard-headed. I needed to know why it was here and where it had come from. What purpose would some old-ass Wendigo have in a small-town city like mine? I sat in the living room while Douglas napped on the couch and Randy dozed off on my pop's recliner. My mind wandered as I leaned back on my chair and closed my eyes. My mind flashed vivid, brilliant images behind my closed eyes. Beautiful green, lush trees swayed in the sunlight. I could feel the heat reflecting onto my face. It had to have been the most beautiful sunny day I had ever seen, not a cloud obstructing the blue skies. I smiled, and in the dream, I closed my eyes and took in the warmth on my skin. As I opened my eyes in the dream, I was met with a sight much different than the one before. Dark, black skies replaced the blue hue that once was. The trees void of leaves, and instead long stringy branches dangled in the wind. I felt my heart heave in my chest as a chill overtook my body. The darkness gripped me tightly. As I peered out across the tree line, I could barely make out a large figure standing against the backdrop of dead trees. I listened intently, only to be met with the sound of the harsh wind napping at my neck, and then, on natural instinct, I blinked. It happened so quickly that I could only stare in horror ahead of me, directly into the fire-brimmed eyes of the creature we had seen that night. The jaw of its skull, stained with crimson, hung slightly at the corner of its mouth. Bright red blood pooled and drooped down onto the beast's chest as it glared into my eyes. The wind around me howled in anger, and the leaves rustling and flying about. The creature stared violently into my eyes, burning a hole into my very pits of my chest. It continued staring, only a foot away from my very own face. I could not run. I could not move. I was forced to withstand the hatred-filled eyes of the Wendigo. All of a sudden, the wind died down completely. Every bit of movement around me came to an eerie halt. That is the moment when the beast spoke. "You have the mercy of the weak. Take heed of my warning. For mercy is not a gift I can offer." Its jaws moved in a steady rhythm as it spoke. "Remove yourself from this land, as I have returned to claim the earth I once roamed." Suddenly, flashes of memories that didn't belong to me pulsed through my thoughts, images of long ago, a forgotten time. I watched as a group of Native Americans flourished on the very ground I was standing on. They hunted, gathered, and cared for their families with the bright blue background of the perfectly sunny day beaming around them. In a flash, I saw the familiar turn of events as darkness clouded the area. The natives were slaughtered, their food taken, their villages destroyed. Men in old pioneer vests revenged the area, killing and taking from the innocent people. The screams of agony were so close that I thought my eardrums would explode. In yet another flash, the same darkness surrounded the area, except the ground was covered in a pure white blanket of snow. I watched in terror as a family near the tree line clung to the very last strings of life. I watched their bodies wither, their bones become pressed against the thin layer of their skin, and then in horror, I saw the young boy breathing his last breath, followed by the father ripping at the deceased boy's flesh. Bloodied, gnarled faces stared back at me as the vision began to fade, revealing the Wendigo again close to my face. I was so close that I could feel its breath on my face. His jaw snapped shut in an instant and then slackened once again. "For what I have lost, I will soon regain. Be wary, wolf, for I have come back to take what was taken from me." The beast snarled a heinous growl, blood and gore splashing from its maw onto my face. My eyes snapped open. I frantically looked around me to see the living room the exact way I remembered. Randy asleep in the recliner and Douglas laid across the couch. My heart thudded in my chest, beating so hard that I thought I might lose consciousness. My body was drenched in sweat, my eyes darting across the room as I attempted to regain some sense of my surroundings. I was terrified, too afraid to even blink. I quickly reached for the standing lamp to my side, struggling to find the string that hung from its shade. I finally grasped it and yanked the light on. I almost tore out of the front room as I was suddenly met with my grandfather's wide eyes, staring at me from the hallway. His body, like mine, drenched in sweat. He trembled harder than I'd ever seen a person tremble before. I then noticed the same fear and horror in his eyes. He opened his mouth, speaking in a deep, raspy tone as he attempted to regain his posture. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I'm a different kind of police officer. Sometimes you must look fear directly in its eyes. Part 5. Let's get straight into that. Silently, as to avoid waking the others in the cabin, Pop and I crept out onto the porch. The lights were dim, casting a ghastly glare on a few feet of grass in front of the cabin. We sat on the porch steps in silence for some time, each of us knowingly giving the other time to gather our thoughts and calm ourselves. After a few minutes of staring off into the darkness that surrounded us, my grandfather spoke first. "It spoke to you too." I nodded, bringing my gaze to my pop's pale blue eyes. "The visions," he trailed off as he continued to catch his breath. That's why it's here. To reclaim the land that was taken from it." He shook his head. I continued to wait on him to speak again. "Ryan, this creature is much more violent than I could have thought. I need you to know that I wouldn't have dared send you and Douglas out there if I knew." His voice cracked a bit before he continued. "If I knew what this creature was capable of." I could see the tears welling up in his eyes in the light emitting from the small bulb on the porch. "Pop," I reached out slowly, grasping his hand as I spoke. You had no way of knowing. We had no way of knowing." I removed my hand from his and reached into my jacket pocket to remove the old journal. I held it in my hands and stared at the leather-bound pages. "These notes were the only real help we could have gotten. You could have never known that they were up against something much more powerful than any of the creatures depicted on these pages." I flipped to the back of the journal where the blank pages began. "However, I believe it's time we added a new entry. This one, though, we can write together." My gaze met his once again, and a solemn smile spread across his face. We spent the rest of the night on that porch, detailing the things we knew about the creature and jotting down the questions of the unknown. At the top of the description, I had written, "Wittiva, Alpha Wendigo," in bold print. "What we need to consider," my pop started as he paced the length of the porch, "is the connection you and I have to the creature. Our histories are very different." He stopped and suddenly looked directly into my eyes. "It's the bloodline, Ryan." He reached out and I handed him the journal. He scribbled a few lines before looking back to me. "I've told you before, our bloodline traces back to the very first werewolves. The beginning of our kind." I concentrated, hanging on to his every word. "This Wendigo, it was the first of its kind. It's the only explanation for how powerful it is." He nodded to himself as he continued. "Its ability to send us visions, to speak to us through our dreams, it makes sense." I nodded in agreement. "That explains why we were the only ones who experienced the dream." I finally spoke, clasping my hands together above my head. Still, a much more imposing question made its way to the forefront of my thoughts. "Pop," I said suddenly, leaning forward and speaking in almost a whisper as I gained his attention. What about that weird fucker, Rustev? What's his deal? Why doesn't he want us going after this monster?" My grandfather squinted, anger written all over his face. He leaned in, inches away from my face. "That son of a bitch," he seethed. "He's a demon, works with the task force on keeping things secretive. But you know what?" I nodded, widening my eyes while waiting on his answer. He looked around, almost as if to make sure we were completely alone. "I can't figure out why he doesn't want us going after this creature, but I may have a good guess." He spoke in a hurried, hushed voice. "Demons need souls, Ryan. They feed off of them. Maybe he wants the creature here for exactly that reason. Horror spread across my face at the realization that my grandfather had made. So, you think Rustev wants the creature here so it can gather souls for him? I shuffled in my seat, still speaking in a hushed tone. Demons are evil, sent straight from the pits of hell, Ryan. They are deceptive, but they are smart. He huffed as his thoughts engulfed him. I also believe that Sean and Shelton know what is happening. They know he caused this. I looked at my pop questioningly. There's no way. They would have certainly said something by now. That's the thing, Ryan. My grandfather gasped as another realization hit him. And what if they can't? What if he's got them under a spell or something that prevents them from talking about it? My mind was completely overwhelmed. This didn't happen often in my line of work. I cannot praise myself for much, but my ability to put two and two together was a gift. These thoughts lingered in my head for a minute before another possibility struck me, like a truck on a deserted highway. If Rustev is able to do something like that, my eyes widened as I made contact with my pops. Maybe he is using the Whatever as a puppet. Maybe he is controlling this thing, I exclaimed through clenched teeth. My grandfather's eyes widened in deep thought and horror as well. We stared at each other for a moment, attempting to let these realizations set in. Our thoughts were interrupted as we both noticed a shuffle in the nearby woods, a faint rustle of leaves, only there was no wind blowing. Both our bodies shifted and gave way to bestial forms as we scanned the area where the noise originated. My grandfather let out a deep, guttural snarl as we found the source of the movement. There, amongst the forest edge, were two pairs of burning red eyes, staring back at us. Beneath one set was that terrifying, sharp, evil grin. I'm a different kind of police officer, and there is much worse on its way. Let's get straight into that. Before my brain could react, my body did. I found myself face to face with Rustev, his ever-lingering sharp smile still gleaming across his face. He did not so much as flinch as I snarled in his face, and instead he stood there staring back at me. The Wendigo behind him swayed back and forth, its eyes fixed on me as well. It was merely seconds before my grandfather was beside me, holding a hairy arm out in front of my chest. I continued snapping and growling at the demon in front of me as he stood wearing that creepy smile across his face. Douglas and Randy were already changed and stood behind me, crouched and ready to fight. And after a few seconds of my gnashing, Douglas placed his clawed hand on my shoulder, immediately calming me down, and I assumed he had a gift of doing that. Good, Rustev snickered. Now that you've calmed down like a good pup, let's chat. I wanted to lunge out, rip out his throat. However, something deep inside my head told me that that was not a good idea. He showed no signs of fear, despite the rage-fueled beast snarling in his face. And from past experiences, I know that that is a sign of a badass psychopath. Aren't you quite the investigators, Victor? You and your grandson here. It's rather sad that you never learn to keep your nose out of business that doesn't pertain to you. My grandfather let out a sharp, deep growl. All of our eyes were fixed on Rustev, ready to strike if we caught any movement. I had enough already. What do you fucking want here, Rustev? I snarled. And what do you need that thing? I glanced quickly to the towering figure behind him. How does this benefit you at all? Rustev looked almost entertained. Too many questions, so little time. It was quite the pleasure, boys. Now, I have a few loose ends I must attend to. He nodded towards the Wendigo. But I shall, of course, leave you in good company. He's quite hungry. I hope you all will hold him over for a while. He then turned to the creature behind him, whispering in a guttural, unknown language. and before any of us could bat an eyelid, Rustev disappeared, vanished completely into the darkness, still shading the forest completely. As soon as Rustev made his grand exit, the beast stepped forward, its head again inches from my own, and it towered above me, its slack jaw dripping with blood down onto my maw. Out of basic instinct and rage, I attacked the giant beast first. The pure strength of this creature is one that I had never experienced and haven't matched still to this day. My jaw clamped onto the Wendigo's shoulder as I dug my teeth deep into its rotted flesh. Almost completely unfazed, it reared back up its long, dangling arm and in one swipe knocked me clear across the yard. I laid there a moment, face down in the dirt, attempting to breathe, but my breath wouldn't come. I hadn't had the breath knocked out of me since my instructor in the police academy tackled me for the first time all those years ago. As my breathing returned, so did my senses. I could faintly begin to hear my grandfather, Randy and Douglas all snarling and ripping at the creature's body. I pushed myself up and onto all fours and whipped my head towards the ensuing fight. I watched as Douglas was torn from the beast's leg and tossed against a thick elm tree to the side. That was all it took for me. I felt my blood begin to boil with fury. Randy and Pop were attacking the beast from either side, quickly evading its attempts to smack them away like it had done to me. I tore from the ground, sprinting on all fours directly at the creature. My body connected with the distracted Wendigo with a loud crunch. I only managed to knock the creature so that it merely swayed, but it was enough. Douglas, who had managed to get back into the fight with an intense speed and using his entire body, knocked the beast's legs from underneath it. We took the opportunity to jump atop of the Wendigo's massive frame and shredded its already disgusting body. Its flesh tasted of pure rot, and the only thing it had resembling blood was a dark, oozing black liquid. I realized that we were in deep shit when the Wendigo burst upwards, sending every one of us flying outward in different directions. It stood to its feet, releasing a roar so powerful that I felt my ears ringing. My grandfather glanced at me, and a rare look of panic in his golden eyes that made me quiver. I closed my eyes and prepared to push myself back up when I was struck with an immense silence. And this silence was so terrifying because it was completely out of place, and I almost feared opening my eyes again, and that's when I heard the humming. A distinct vibrating sound came from the direction of the beast. It became louder and louder as I looked up, completely entranced by what was happening. The Wendigo hovered in the air, its jaw still slacked open to the side. A purple hue surrounded its entire body, rendering it completely still and silent. The rest of the group, struggling to get up, locked eyes on what I was seeing. I heard the soft pattering of feet on grass behind us, coming from the side of Pop's cabin. As the footsteps came closer, the humming radiating from the monster became higher and higher pitched. I snapped my head around to focus on where the footsteps were coming from. I could not believe what awaited my gaze. Enveloped in a white light, like the angel in my dreams she is, stood Tessa. Her hands shone a bright purple haze, her face winced as she struggled to contain her power directly onto the Wendigo. The humming was so loud now that it could have easily burst my eardrums. As we all stared in awe at the sight laid out before us over the pitch of the humming, Tess shrieked, "You big bitch!" as she continued advancing towards the creature. As she stepped beside where I laid, she used one hand to create an orb of white light, which she then threw in our direction. The next thing I knew, darkness enveloped the world around me. I felt as if I had been punched directly in the face as I blinked open my eyes. It took a moment for me to regain consciousness of my surroundings. The only problem was, Randy, Douglas, Pop and I were no longer in the forest surrounding his cabin. Instead, we were placed directly on the top of a mountain, known around here as Quail's Ridge. We were all back in our human forms, staring at one another with a dumbfounded expression on our faces. The wind was freezing, and there we were, stark-ass naked, sitting in a circle in the snow, atop a fucking mountain. Not my worst Friday morning. We made our way back to Randy's little lodge, as it was the closest to where we were. We walked back in silence, as we were still in shock over the events that had just taken place. As we dried ourselves off and put on some of Randy's clothing, it was 2 sizes too big for all of us, we gathered around Randy's fireplace that he'd lit as we got there. And we knew that Tess could transport herself out of harm's way, and she was much, much more powerful than any of us could really grasp. I still had that unnerving fear lingering in my chest either way. The weather was becoming quite hazardous, and a blizzard was approaching from the north. I sat in silence, tapping my feet repeatedly as the others held a quiet conversation around me. And without warning, Randy's door shot open, hitting the side with a loud thud. I swear, I almost tore out of my skin in fright. Tess tore through the doorway and strode right up to me. Her hair was wild, and an intense fire burned in her eyes. With a quick flick of her wrist, she slapped the ever-loving shit out of me. I sat there, caught completely off guard, and at a loss for words. When I finally averted my gaze to meet her eyes, I was met with something that set off an alarm in my entire body. She was crying. Tears rolled down her face, and I wanted nothing more than to grab her and hold her. I stood up and reached for her, and she pushed my arm away. "You're absolutely insane!" she yelled, the others looking on in concern. "All of you fucking idiots!" She turned to look at each person in the group, and every one of them terrified to meet her gaze. "You chose to try and fight an ancient Wativa? A fucking alpha Wendigo? You're all clearly lost your minds," she fumed as she sat on the couch next to me. "And yes, before any of you assholes speak, I know about Rustev. I know the whole situation, which is why I cannot make myself believe you'd attempt to take on that beast." Her red hair scattered like wildfire around her face as her eyes returned to a normal and her body began to relax. "You know? How?" I questioned hesitantly, bracing for an impact. "I know when a demon is nearby. I could sense that bastard from miles away. I just had no idea that you 4 would be involved," she explained as she ran her hands through her dishevelled hair. I looked at her again, confusion still evident across my face. "I don't understand. Why is it such a big deal? We could have handled it eventually." I trailed off as I saw anger begin to burn in her eyes again. She got up and right in my face as I winced. I'm not too afraid of a lot, but a pissed off Tessa? Now that was frightening. "You literally have no idea what you're dealing with," she growled through gritted teeth. She was a witch, but her growls were absolutely ferocious. "As you know, that Wendigo is an alpha, first of its fucking kind. It's powerful, Ryan." I opened my mouth to protest, but her eyes told me to keep my mouth shut and listen. "Not only is it an alpha Wendigo, but it's being controlled by a sadistic demon." She stared at me, finally huffing and taking a seat once more. My brave Pop spoke up next. "Tess, it was powerful. We realized that. We wouldn't have made it out of there if it wasn't for you," he said, a solemn look upon his face. She glanced at him, the fire in her eyes gone and replaced with sadness. Pop dropped his head and looked to the ground. Tess then stood, looked around the room to each of us. She choked up as she spoke. "You boys don't understand. There is something big coming. Rustev needs souls. And that Wendigo? It's only the beginning. The creature is off your trail for now." Her eyes furrowed as she worryingly looked out of the window into the approaching blizzard. "There is much, much worse on its way." I'm a different kind of police officer. I've never been out of the country before. Part 6. Let's get straight into that. Our brains have a distinct way of processing bad news. Some of us panic and spiral out of control. Others completely shut down and turn off their emotions completely. In this case, every one of us stared ahead, quiet in disbelief. We were shutting down. My thoughts could not process Tess's last sentence. There is much worse on its way. My mind scattered as I thought of the different meanings of what she had said. Worse? What could be worse than a demon sick with a need for power, and an ancient Wendigo that was controlled by said demon? We sat quietly, all attempting to process our thoughts separately, trying to grasp at her words and what it meant for us. My grandfather was the first to break the eerie silence. As he stood and looked around the room, we each solemnly stared back, waiting on him to speak. Alright, boys. Here's what I know. The only plan I have left to deal with this shit. I'm making this up as I go, so stay alert. And ask questions, if you have them, along the way. He ran a glance across the room and we all nodded in agreement. He reached down and lifted the tattered leather journal from the table it had been tossed upon. I don't even remember how it had gotten there, but I suppose Tess had recovered it for my pop. He gently flipped through a few pages before resting his aging hand on one of the later entries. I can tell you this much, he began, his eyes shifting from us to the journal and back as he spoke. We've got to get a handle on the Wendigo before we deal with Rustev. That monster is too powerful to be controlled by that asshole. He looked to Randy, who seemed to already be ahead of Pop's thoughts. This means that we'll need a special kind of help, one that we cannot get ourselves. He then looked to Tess, who was sitting at a chair on the other side of the living room, still seething with anger. And she immediately cocked her head to the side and glared at my grandfather, hesitantly awaiting his proposal. In this journal, I have made many entries on many different species that I've come across in my travels. He tore his stare away from Tess as he glanced again across the room at each of us as he explained. Many creatures who are much older than our species, much more powerful as well. He stared down at his open journal before continuing his speech. Out of those, there are a few that would match an alpha Wendigo in terms of strength, and only one who I believe could defeat the creature entirely. My grandfather's eyes met Tess again, and she sunk deep in thought, wondering what he was speaking of. I only know of one such creature, one I inadvertently ran into decades ago on an overseas trip. The beast is very old, over 1,000 years. Its sole mission these days is that of ridding the earth of some of the most evil, powerful entities. Tess's head shot up, her eyes widened in acknowledgement. She stood from where she was sitting, staring directly into my pop's eyes. In a newfound confidence, a small grin took over her face as she realized what creature my grandfather was speaking of. As her eyes attained a level of brightness I had not seen in days, she said one name in a quiet whisper. Brevan. I had never heard the name before. Douglas glanced at me in confusion as I shrugged my shoulders and turned my attention back to my grandfather. Brevan, yes. I had not thought of that asshole in years, but he could most certainly defeat this Wendigo with ease. Tess slumped back into her seat, her face showing a deep concentration. I looked to Randy. He also sat with his chin in his hands, deep in thought. It seemed like Douglas and I were the only ones out of the loop, and I am not a fan of being out of the loop. Well, I spoke for the first time in a while. Is anyone going to explain what this Brevan thing is? I threw my hands up in complete frustration. I could feel Douglas rolling his eyes at my apparent agitation. My grandfather turned to Douglas and I, as he thought hard to find the words to explain the creature to us. Brevan is an ancient being. Like I said, he's old. Much older than the first of our kind, and much older than the first Wendigo. With his age comes a certain power that not many other creatures of myth have ever achieved. He once roamed the earth in anger, after being held captive and forced into cannibalistic tendencies, not unlike the Wendigo. Long ago, something in him changed. Now, he hunts the evil of the world and eradicates it from existence. I nodded my head, staring into my grandfather's now golden eyes. Sir Pup, what is it? I cocked my head to the side, seeing Douglas do the same just out of my sight. My grandfather, still holding his journal from days past, turned it around to show us a well-drawn portrait. The entity portrayed a head of a bull, with long horns extending from its skull. Its body was similar to humans, but had obsidian black hooves where its hands and feet should be. Its skin and a thin layer of fur were a dull white colour, and its eyes shone a blazing orange colour. When I looked to the top of the page, scrawled in black ink, was the word Minotaur. I looked to Douglas to see him already looking at me in confusion. Oh, I knew the questions were about to run out of his mouth like a waterfall. No fucking way! His mouth dangled open, while he attempted to process what he was seeing. Bravan is a powerful Minotaur, one who holds great strength and knowledge of the world. He is not quite fond of our kind, as I experienced at our last encounter. It took quite a good amount of convincing that I was not evil and not a threat, before he decided he would spare me of bashing my head into the pavement. My grandfather spoke, a hint of a chuckle escaping a serious demeanour on his face. Which is why I am going with you all, Tess interrupted. I glanced around the room as my mind tried to process what exactly was happening. Randy stood up and disappeared into his room as I noticed a smirk on his face as he walked past me. My grandfather shrugged his shoulders and headed to the door. Can somebody explain what the actual shit we're doing right now? The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. My grandfather walked up to where I was sitting and placed a hand on my shoulder. He glanced from me to Douglas with a grin appearing across his face. Pack your bags, boys, he said as his eyes brightened their golden hue. We're headed for Greece. I'm a different kind of police officer. I now truly believe in destiny. Update. Let's get straight into that. There are no wrong turnings, only paths we had not known we were meant to walk. Guy Gavriel, K. Tigana. Anybody that knows me well enough knows I am not afraid of many things, except heights. I can't explain why, but the thought of flying has always made my stomach drop. The very next day we were on a plane headed for Greece. Douglas and I took some vacation time from work, although I can't help but wish we were actually taking a vacation. Randy and Pop sat together on the plane, spending the entire flight going over how exactly we were going to approach the situation. Douglas and I took another approach. We excitedly planned travels to tourist destinations around Greece. Like I said, I'd never been out of the country before. Upon arrival, my Pop was straight down to business. He had a few contacts in Greece and needed to speak to a few people in order to find out where Bravan was located. We spent most of the first day in Greece tracking down acquaintances of Pop's. I had the opportunity to meet quite a few were beings and learn a bit about the culture surrounding Greece. I'm quite a fan of Greek food, for the record. My last stop had us meeting an extremely interesting lizard creature named Entok, reminding me of a lot of the fabled lizard man of South Carolina. He invited us to his home to stay for the night, and we quickly accepted his offer. Entok was nice enough, although he gave off that same rugged demeanour that both my Pop and Randy possessed. I imagine they had went on some pretty crazy adventures back in the day. We slept in makeshift cots on the floor of Entok's living room. Tired and jet-lagged, Douglas and I passed out immediately. I awoke to the light outside almost blinding me. Douglas laid next to me, still deep in his sleep and snoring louder than a raggedy fan next to our cots. I glanced around the room expecting to see Randy and my Pop still asleep on the floor, but they were gone. Their cots had been folded and placed neatly on the ground next to the old couch. I shut up, grabbing at Douglas's arm and shaking him awake as I listened intently to our surroundings. He lazily pulled himself upwards without saying a word, noticing the look of confusion on my face. Our fears were relieved as we heard the faint sound of booming laughter coming from the backyard. I jumped up, Douglas in tow, and we shot across the house to the back porch where Entok, Randy and my pop was sitting. Beside them on the porch laid 4 large camping bags, each filled to the brim with equipment. Nobody said anything about camping. We stepped onto the porch and were greeted by the 3 men as they caught up their lives with each other. We happened to walk out just in time to hear a familiar and heartbreaking story being told. Shame about old Alec. Entok glanced at Douglas and I, a deep sadness showing in his deep burgundy eyes. My mind drifted back to that day as we were underground in that bunker. I flashed back in my mind to unchaining Douglas from the wall and winced as I remembered that screeching noise at the gate that released Vernon's beastly form. The look of content in the old wolf's red eyes, shooting me one final glance before I carried Douglas from the room, still stirs my heart to this day. I'm alive because of Alec, Douglas said, his voice bringing me back to the present. He fought off Vernon so that Ryan and I could escape, he said with his eyes staring at the ground. A damn good fella Alec was. He died a hero, whether he meant to or not. Entok sighed, his voice beaming with pride for his fallen friend. He then looked surprised, as a thought sprung to life in his mind. Did you all take care of Vernon? He's dead, right? Entok looked around at the 4 of us, a wild look in his eyes. He's dead. We made sure of that, my grandfather said sternly, still remembering that fateful day. Randy, though, had a questioning look on his face. Why, Entok, what's that crazy look on your face about? Randy leaned forward, confused and eager. You fellas don't get it, Entok replied, his mind moving a mile a minute. You purged a real, violent, life-changing evil from this world when you killed Vernon. He stood from his rickety chair to his feet. We all stared in confusion as he frantically continued speaking. Prevan exterminates evil. That's his whole purpose for living on this planet. If he finds out what you fellas did, he'll be eager to speak to you. It's exactly what we needed to get you all in to see him. I looked to my grandfather and Randy as a realization sprung to life in their eyes. Entok continued. Prevan only meets with those he deems worthy, those who have made a significant impact on life as we know it. I'd say that killing an insane hybrid creating powerhouse like Vernon is pretty significant, don't you think? Entok's dark eyes glowed a little brighter as he spoke, looking around to each of us. My pop and Randy both smiled, relief washing over their faces. Pop stood and looked around at us, his demeanor brightening with each passing second. He laid his glance again on Entok. How soon can you relay the word to him? He asked, anxiety rising in his chest. Without missing a beat, the old reptilian creature pulled his ancient phone from his pocket and began picking at the screen with his long, sharp nails. It's done. Entok smiled as he glanced back at my grandfather. He looked again to each of our surprised faces as we struggled to comprehend what exactly the hell just happened. With a wide, sharp-toothed smile, he placed a scaly hand on my shoulder. You boys better get your asses ready, he huffed. You'll be meeting with one of the most powerful beings on this planet, tonight. Wear something nice, will you? Entok beamed as he mumbled something under his breath about a map and rushed inside. I looked again to my grandfather and Randy as they stared peacefully into the distance of the morning light. Randy laughed and shook his head. That bastard is looking out for us, even beyond the damned grave, he beamed. My grandfather smiled at Randy, his whole face gleaming with pride. He looked out again to the distance, deep in memories and thought. Does that enough? My pop spoke in a rusty Russian accent. "You were right, Alec. There certainly is no escape from fate." I'm a different kind of police officer. And sometimes it's the little things. Let's get straight into that. Did you know that among other wild species, Greece's forests are home to wolves? I didn't. We were set off through beautiful and luscious Greek forests on our way to the mountain ranges of Mount Uiti. Deep in these ranges, at the base of Pygros, we were set off through beautiful and luscious Greek forests on our way to the mountain ranges of Mount Uiti. Deep in these ranges, at the base of Pyrgos, was the den that occupied the Minotaur, and of course that meant that we had to set up camp quite a few times. It was our second night settling in that we heard them, a group of loud, terrifying howls that bellowed throughout the forest, making the ground seem to shake beneath us. My grandfather looked at me and smiled peacefully. "They're establishing their territory, boy. No need to get all shaky on me." Randy and Douglas laughed. Randy piped in, his eyes glowing that familiar golden hue in the dark. "You two better go introduce yourselves. I hate to get into a tussle with the locals here." I looked at my pop beside our makeshift fire, who then nodded at me, a smile escaping his lips. "Well, it's about time you met some real wolves of Greece," he grunted as he lifted himself from his place by the fire. "Pop, what if they attack? I do not believe slaughtering a pack of wolves will look good to Brevan." I huffed as I stood to follow him. "Trust me, Ryan, that will not happen." Pop and I sped through the forest, ducking under large tree limbs and massive amounts of foliage. The earthly scent reminded me that this land was untouched by humans for a long time. We headed out in a direction that the howls had rung out, remaining on all fours throughout the run. It was only a minute or so before I caught the scent of their territory, and we were entering theirs. It wasn't long before we came upon a foggy clearing. The mist was light, but it seemed to engulf my lungs and made it difficult to breathe. The air around us was thick and humid, and even with that enhanced vision, we could barely make out the tree line on the other side of the clearing. My pop suddenly stopped, holding out his arm as if to stop me in my tracks. We stood in silence for what seemed like an eternity, staring into the foggy darkness. I had no idea what exactly we were waiting for, but I had faith that my grandfather did. I focused my eyesight on the edge of the forest in front of me, waiting on any kind of movement that I could detect. As I watched, I heard a small branch crack in half. The sound was almost deafening, breaking the silence that my ears had adjusted to. I snapped my head to the spot immediately, catching my grandfather already staring in the direction of the noise. And from out of the dense fog, I noticed two sets of large, bluish-green eyes entering the clearing. The wolves that the eyes belonged to were huge, especially for this area and landscape. Their fur was a rusty brown and much shorter than ours. One was much larger than the other and stepped towards us, cautiously. Pop spoke first, quietly and carefully, his animalistic voice calm to a soft growl. "We are here to see Brevan. We mean you and your pack no harm. We plan to have our meeting and leave you in peace." Well, the larger wolf seemed to actually understand what my grandfather had said, as it nodded and turned. After a few steps back towards the forest, it looked back at us, signaling for us to follow it. Hesitantly, we carefully stayed on all fours behind the two wolves. We followed them for a few minutes, exchanging curious glances along the way. We approached what seemed like a giant cave. Evidently the wolves were leading us to their den. Stepping through the entrance, the cave was dry and clear of fog, a vast difference compared to the outside. The wolves led us to the back of the den where we saw a dozen more pairs of those bluish green eyes, and they were introducing us to their pack. Without a word being said, we nodded at the wolves who were all staring us down. The largest of the two wolves that led us here must have been the alpha, as it walked over to the medium-sized wolf surrounded by 4 or 5 pups. The alpha looked over its shoulder at us, and my pup nudged me forward. I hesitantly walked up to the mum and her pups, sniffing at her silently. The pups looked up at me, and I felt my heart melt a little. The pups gave me a curious look, naturally noticing the differences between our bodies. I couldn't help but smile back at them. The reality of it all still makes me smile to this day. There I was, at a mountain range, looking for an ancient minotaur in the middle of a Greek forest, surrounded by native wolves and their pups, and with a big toothy grin across my canine face. Looking back, it's probably one of the more peaceful moments during my adventure. Wordlessly, we made peace with the natives of the woodland, and the alpha led us to the bend in the mountain that would lead us to the minotaur. We said our farewells as I took one last glance at the pups, raising my clawed hand in a wave. They stared at my grandfather and I, still understandably confused. We headed back to camp at close to midnight. Douglas and Randy were fast asleep. Their ungodly snores rang throughout my eardrums at hundreds of feet away. We turned and put our clothes back on before climbing into the tent. When you work in law enforcement or any other agency that is dangerous or deals with handling the public, you learn to cherish the small things. I knew back home things could become chaotic. In the same thought, I was under the stars far away in Greece with my best friend and the closest family I had. The situation may become intense when we got back home, but in that particular moment, everything seemed all right. I slept wholesomely that night, probably the best night's sleep I'd gotten since the whole ordeal had begun. When I woke up, the sun had risen and my grandfather was already gone. I stepped into the early morning light and with a nice surprise awaiting me in camp. My grandfather, Randy and Douglas were cooking breakfast over the small campfire. Behind them, standing in a line all facing me, was the pack of wolves we met last night. The large, brown alpha had brought a freshly killed deer to the camp, and Randy was field dressing it and my grandfather cooking it. The small pups from last night were impatiently waiting, tails wagging and barking in intervals. Once again, I found myself smiling and my heart full. We ate as much as we could hold, every one of us getting plenty. I played with the pups after breakfast, rolling around in the grass and laughing to my heart's delight. My heart hung a little bit as the wolves left their den once again, but the experience in itself was enough to keep me jovial for a long time to come. And with our hearts and stomachs full, we packed our camp and started the journey to the cave where the Minotaur was located. I can't say I wasn't at least a little bit nervous. Few had the opportunity to meet this legend, much less ask for its help against the angsty demon in a completely different country. My grandfather seemed confident that he knew what to do and what to say, and I trusted him more than anyone else. However, as we treaded down an actual unbeaten path, I couldn't help but feel my chest tighten. My grandfather and Randy trotted along with not even a hint of being unsure in their step. They chatted with one another about old times, laughing along the way. Douglas was unusually quiet. I believe he felt the same nervousness that I felt too. We had a large task ahead of us. I felt that the uncertainty between us was well reasoned. We had dealt with crazy situations before, both normal and supernatural, but this task was by far the most important. We kept walking while I was deep in my thoughts until I almost ran headfirst into Randy, who was stopped in his tracks. I lifted my head to see the entrance of a pitch-black cave, the most notable aspect of which was the dank, musky scent emanating from within. Douglas gagged and I laughed. "Here we are, boys," Randy bellowed loudly, reverberating throughout the cavern walls. You guys ready for a good time? Randy glanced at us, followed by a quick laugh. We're as ready as we can be. I nodded to Douglas, who still looked pretty terrified. My pop spoke up. Let's go meet your first Minotaur, fellas. A grin spread across his face. We hesitantly followed Randy and Pop into the darkness, fully shifting just in case we ran into any funny business. The cave was hot and humid, making me wish I'd showered before heading in. We must have walked through the cave for at least an hour, the claustrophobia weighing heavily on our shoulders. I sure wish we didn't have to walk through here fully transformed. My head is touching the ceiling. Douglas groaned and rubbed a clawed hand over his head. My pop huffed, and I could almost feel his eyes rolling in his head. And just as the humidity and small space were about to drive us crazy, we saw a small, dimly lit opening at the end of the cave. I perked my ears and looked to Douglas, who was still crouching down and staring at the ceiling. I heard their heavy breathing before we even made it to the opening. My steps became more and more careful. The opening led to a huge section of the cave, lit by torches that were strategically placed along the entrance. Large, pale rocks lined the cave floor, working as a walkway towards the back of the opening. And suddenly, a booming voice greeted us from a small, pillared surface in the back.
Open up, pig.
It bellowed, power emanating from its voice.
Hello, I am Brivan, and I've been expecting you.
I'm a different kind of police officer. Other times, it's the bigger things. Let's get straight into that. Books and Google images do not do the hulking appearance of the Minotaur justice. Brivan easily towered over the group. Everything about him intimidated the hell out of us. He stood on his hind legs at 10 feet tall. The mythological view behind the Minotaur is fairly accurate. A massive head of a bull and giant protruding horns at top. I watched Douglas's eyes grow wide as the monstrous figure came into view. I could feel the horror radiating from my partner, but mixed in was the feeling of pure fascination. We all stared at Brivan, waiting for him to speak first. At the time, I would have said we waited to be respectful, but looking back I knew it was because Douglas and I were utterly petrified. The Minotaur's booming voice almost caused both Douglas and I to jump out of our skin.
It's safe to assume that you are the ones who handled the situation with Dr. Frankenstein, is it not?
Brivan's voice sounded ancient, and the smile that crept across his face made me shudder. It didn't take long for Pop to realize that Douglas and I were literally scared speechless, and so he spoke first. Brivan, it is good to see you. It's been a long time. Pop stepped forward, extending his hand to the Minotaur. Brivan took it in a hard grasp. I almost snickered as I saw my grandfather wince a bit. And yes, turns out Vernon was very much alive. We found out that he was creating an army of those monstrosities. Pop stepped back beside Randy and I. Brivan slowly looked up into the darkness of the cavern, his eyes closed tightly.
I thought I had rid the earth of his madness all those years ago.
He softly drops his glance back to us, with a solemn look in his beastly eyes.
What of the filth? The Russian wolf? If my memory serves me right, his name is Alec, correct?
Randy and my Pop exchanged glances, their gazes sad and heartbroken. My utter surprise, Douglas stepped forward towards Brivan and spoke up, clear and determined. Mr. Brivan, sir, Alec gave his life to save mine. I owe him all that I have, sir. He then bowed his head and stepped back in line next to me. Brivan gave him a solemn look and bowed his massive head as he spoke.
Sacrifice comes with the greatest honor one could obtain. I mourn for the loss of your friend with you all.
He lifted his head to meet our gaze once again.
I owe you great thanks for handling the situation there in the States for me. I had only heard of it after the fact, but I understand that there is something else, something extremely pressing that has come to my attention.
Bravan shifted his massive frame and walked towards a small fire that lit up the back of the cave. We followed him. Once we made our way to the campfire, we each took a seat across from Bravan. He looked much more intimidating, illuminated by the fire. We have a potentially devastating issue with an extremely dangerous demon back home, Bravan. Randy spoke from across the flames of the fire. We cannot face this situation on our own. That fact in itself is why we are here. Bravan sat more upright, moving his glance across the four of us.
Yes, I knew that someday problems would arise from Rustev.
He curiously stopped his gaze on my pop.
And, from what I understand, he is in control of an ancient and dangerous Wendigo.
My pop nodded his head in agreement.
You know the ways of old. I will not allow a creature to threaten the way of life here on this earth. You all have done me a great honor, one that I will soon return.
Bravan's bestial face turned solid. Pure determination and will scorned his emotions.
You have traveled a long way to find me, and for that I thank you. I will make your journey home much shorter, as I am advanced in the ancient ways.
He paused, followed by what looked to be a grin on his face.
I assume you understand. I cannot take human transportation.
All I remember is the giant minotaur snapping his hooves together. We all awoke back in Randy's cabin. My first sight as I painfully opened my eyes was Douglas, on his knees, projectile puking across the floor. My own nausea hit me at that time and I began my own spell of vomiting onto Randy's beautiful rug. Pop and Randy sat on the couch peacefully, watching as we ruined Randy's furniture. Pop put his hand on Randy's shoulder and he dropped his face into his hands. That rug was from Spain. It holds a multitude of memories. And Pop chuckled, patting his back as he mourned the loss of his precious rug. Well, now it holds a multitude of stains. As our sickness began to lessen, we finally found ourselves able to stand up and walk around. The good news was, teleportation from that distance is otherwise impossible, if not for Bravan. We found a minotaur outside, his hulking body cross-legged at the bottom of the porch stairs. His head was raised towards the sky, eyes open wide. He's attempting to locate the little shithead, Randy said, answering our curious looks. Suddenly, Bravan's head snapped across his shoulder back at us. His eyes were glowing a brilliant red.
I see a woman, a witch. He has her trapped on the side of the mountain, not far from here.
We all turned towards one another, frantically exchanging confused looks. That's when it hit us like a train. Pop growled intensely, his eyes turning that familiar golden hue. That fucker has got Tessa. I'm a different kind of police officer. There are bad monsters, but there are also some that are great. Let's get straight into that. Time seemed to come to a complete standstill. As soon as the realization of the situation clicked in our heads, our darkest and most monstrous forms burst upon our bodies. Before I even had a chance to regain my thoughts, we had violently thrashed through the forest and were stood snarling in front of Tessa's house. The once peaceful and tranquil aura that radiated from Tessa's cabin was now black as night, and we could feel pure evil lingering in the air. Douglas, Randy, Pop, Brevan and I stood before the small home in a pure rage, ready to tear apart anything that walked through the front door. Brevan was the most menacing of us all. Fire filled his eyes and his body trembled with power. Something about his presence and violent anger had my inner being begging to turn arse and run, but I knew I wouldn't. Brevan stepped ahead of us and growled the deepest, most horrifying snarl that I've ever heard in my life. I'm sure I even saw Douglas flinch out of the corner of my eye.
Rustev!
Brevan boomed, growling into the area and directed it at the cabin.
You and I have business to finish. Let us finish it now.
I watched as his body shook and I felt a very ancient and unheard of power radiating from his body. We all snarled and gnashed our teeth in unison, letting the bastard know that we were all there, and we were pissed. Before I could even comprehend what had happened, a giant form blew from the tree line and tackled Randy to the ground. I knew immediately that the figure was the Wendigo, and for the first time in my life I saw a hint of fear in Randy's blazing eyes. But that fear, it didn't last long. Without a word, faster than the blink of an eye, Brevan moved to the creature and tore it off of Randy. And what happened next truly shone the sheer capability of the Minotaur, and will forever be ingrained in my memories as long as I live. An unimaginable display of power. Brevan held the Wendigo by the head between its giant antlers and lifted it into the air. Without a second thought and without a word spoken, I noticed Brevan's grip on the beast tighten. The ancient Minotaur grinned the most terrifying smile I had ever seen. And then came the crunch. Brevan, using one huge arm, crushed the skull of the Wendigo in one quick flash. He then skillfully and easily tore the Wendigo's gangly body completely in half, dropping each piece to his side. Brevan tore his horrifying smile from the mutilated beast and eyed the cabin once again, and we all followed his gaze, rendered speechless by the beast. Without warning, the atmosphere around us began to change. We felt our lungs tighten as we all gasped for breath. Except for Brevan, of course. A thick, red fog began to envelop us all at once and extremely quickly. Brevan's gaze did not falter. His eyes did not leave the door of the cabin. Neither did ours. Rustev appeared like a strike of lightning, standing directly in front of Brevan with that same god-awful smile spread across his face. All at once, Randy, Pop, Douglas and I lunged directly for the demon. Brevan held out both of his strong, enormous arms, effectively and abruptly stopping us all in our tracks. And for the first time since we had arrived, Brevan broke his gaze from straight ahead and turned to me. His fiery eyes bored deep into my innermost being, and then he spoke. It was not verbal, and it was not out loud. He spoke directly to my mind in a language that I did not know, yet I understood.
Find the witch, then take your loved ones and go. Go far from here and do not look back.
He returned his gaze to Rustev, who was indeed still smiling. In a burst of fur and agility, my Pop snatched me up and Randy did the same with Douglas, and we were flying through the trees unimaginatively quick. I could hear sounds all around me, branches snapping, the quick and raspy breaths of my Pop and Randy, and the crashing of trees in their path. But one sound stood out from the rest and caught me completely off guard. And the best way I could describe it is how atomic bombs are depicted in the movies. What I heard sounded like a loud crack of thunder, followed by the most intense sonic boom I ever felt in my life. It was so strong that it flung us all completely through the trees and crashed us out into the open field. We woke minutes later, still in our bestial forms. Randy and Pop splayed out across the meadow. When we woke, both Douglas and I leaned up against the tree. The space looked familiar, like an old friend who you hadn't seen in a long time. It felt safe. It felt calm. When I regained my senses, I realized exactly where we were and looked at Douglas, who was beginning to do the same. We were leaned against the old oak tree, the one where Douglas's life had changed, the one that I'd spent so much time crouched under, relishing the peaceful times. We smiled at one another, realizing that we were safe. We were elated when we saw Pop and Randy walking our way, safe, save for a few bruises. It was Douglas who raised his eyes above my head and stared at the trunk of the tree behind me. And directly above my head, burned into the bark of the old oak, was a large, still burning imprint of a hoof. Wow, 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 wow. Certainly another one. Wow. Absolutely wonderful, as ever, from the big bad wolf over on Reddit No Sleep. Definitely worth the wait there, brother. Thank you ever so much for updating this series. I've enjoyed both of them. You definitely have an incredible knack with words, and storyline just ties up seamlessly. Absolutely wonderful. Of course, guys and girls, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. Of course, if you are an aspiring writer or just fancy having a crack at things, please do get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforustofear@gmail.com. Obviously, I feel there's quite a bit more to come from this series, and I'll keep an eye on the posts and update as and when that happens. Well, another one bites the dust, no pun intended. I hope you guys are all well and happy and keeping fit and focused as possible during these testing times. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.